heard that version, she might have wanted to do something. She might have rethought her approach. You know, that song does come from pop music. That message of you are amazing. And that's very resonant with who we are in Unity. What do we teach all the time? You know, it's like that's who you are. You are the light of God. Jesus said it. I mean, it's not original to Katy Perry. Jesus said it first. You are the light of the world. Before I launch into the message, a story. There's a story of a man who worked at the post office. His job was to process all the mail items that had illegible addresses. One day a letter came to his desk, addressed in a shaky handwriting to God. He thought, I better open this one to see what it's all about. So he opened it and he read, Dear God, I'm an 83-year-old widow living on a very small pension. Yesterday someone stole my purse. It had $100 in it, which was all the money I had until my next pension check. Next Sunday is Easter, and I had invited 2 of my friends over for dinner. And without that money, I have nothing to buy food with. I have no family to turn to, and you are my only hope. God, can you please help me? The postal worker was touched and moved, and he went around showing the letter to others. Each of them dug into their wallet and came up with a few dollars. By the time he had made the rounds, he collected $96, which he then put into an envelope and sent it to her. The rest of the day, all the workers in the post office felt a warm glow thinking about the nice thing they had done. Easter came and went, and a few days later, another letter from the old lady to God. All the workers gathered around while the letter was opened, and it read, Dear God, how can I ever thank you enough for what you did for me? Because of your generosity, I was able to fix a lovely dinner for my friends. We had a very nice day. I told my friends about your wonderful gift. By the way, there was $4 missing. It was no doubt those thieving so-and-sos at the post office. It doesn't really relate, but it's just a good story. So tonight I'm talking about putting the ego in its place. Yeah, I'm surprised anybody came to this talk tonight. I thought that's not a very sexy topic, but thank you for being brave as I'm going to challenge us all. Before we launch into it, I thought it would be good to talk about some definitions. So there are 3 here that I found on Google. From the vernacular, the way we use it, an ego is a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. So when we say someone has an inflated ego, that they have an overly developed sense of self-importance. In psychology, it says this, the part of the mind which mediates between the conscious and the unconscious and is responsible for reality testing and a sense of personal identity. And then in philosophy, it's a conscious thinking subject. They're all different. And none of those are the spiritual definition. So this is what I have come up with. The gospel, according to Reverend Michael Gott, is the spiritual definition that we talk about with the ego. It's the separate self. In Unity, we teach there's how many of us are there? One. Thank you, Keith Vivens. He knows. There's only one life, one presence, and each of us is an expression of God's own love, light, power, beauty, peace, and joy, and freedom. That's who we are. That's all there is. So our unified self, when I know that I'm one with God, when I know that I'm one with others, when I know that I'm one with everything, there's no ego there. And it is the ego that will want to separate us into distinct, separate beings that have no relation, and that's when we get into trouble, right? Because then we begin to think, this is mine. One of my favorite poems from Hafiz, he says, forget mine, that is the end. Whatever he says, I forgot. It's a great poem, I'll read it later. And so, if we're talking about the separate self as being the definition in the spiritual sense of ego, then it begins to make sense of the way we often use it. There are 3 times that I have experienced a quote or some teaching around the ego in Unity and in the New Thought tradition that have really moved me and have healed me. The first, I was singing for Marianne Williamson in Scottsdale, Arizona, maybe 9 years ago, and she read this quote or spoke this quote from the Course in Miracles, and it's like my head blew off. And she said, would you be hostage to the ego or host to God? And this is a question every moment. This is a choice we're making every moment. Would we be hostage to the ego or host to God? And it explains so much of my life. How many of my difficulties and my struggles have I been hostage to the ego's demands? And if I can release my need for significance, my need for power and approval, then something can happen. God can move through me and use me. So I love this quote from the Course. When I was in 12 steps, I'm still a 12-stepper, but when we would gather at the end of the meetings, we would hold hands, we would say the Lord's Prayer, and instead of lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from ego. For thine is the power. This was something that a lot of people, particularly people who, like you Unity people who don't like want to talk about evil, so this actually works. You might try it. Deliver us from ego. And I realized if you're in any recovery, if you've experienced an addiction, it is that separate self that is causing all the problems. And one of the addiction reinforces this idea that we're separate. And so to gain healing and recovery, it's releasing the ego, allowing God to use us again. The third step is the became willing to turn our will and our lives over to God, the care of our lives over to God. And then the third one that was, I don't know where I first heard this, but Reverend Mindy Lawrence told me that this comes from a former minister of this church. Reverend Sig Paulson created this acronym for ego, edging God out. I've heard that in a couple of different places, but that explained kind of what the ego, how its function was in a spiritual setting. That it's when, do you remember last week Alexis Rice was talking to us and she said, why do we struggle with thy will be done? Because we're afraid that we're not going to get my will. I'm not going to get what I want when I want it. That if I turn my will and my life over to the care of God, as I understand or misunderstand God, maybe it's not going to turn out the way I want. But which I is it that wants it that way? There's only one of you, only one of us. But when we're talking in the terms of the spiritual and the ego, it's helpful to think of, you have two of you. There is the higher self and the separate self. The higher self is your true nature. It is your spiritual identity. It is what and who you are, and it is birthless, deathless, changeless, cannot be harmed or changed. It is eternally revealing God's essence. That's who and what you are. Can I get an amen? Amen. Thank you. But the part of you that does experience this human experience where, not only am I not like you, I'm not even like me, like I was last week. It's all changing, and there's all this, we do experience birth and death and change. And so here, we have a separate self. And in the spiritual traditions, particularly in New Thought, we make it wrong. As a matter of fact, sometimes we've replaced the evil and the devil with the ego. And we think that when we're having an ego moment or when we're having some sort of a separation experience, like we've messed up, that's our New Thought version of I am a sinner. My ego is going on. Say, that's my ego. So I wanted to, hopefully tonight, what I want to offer to you is a little bit different way of holding the ego. As I've already mentioned, these are three examples of the spiritual definition of the ego, the separate self, that have really moved me, and I continue to use them. But I want to talk for a moment, go back to that psychological definition and have a different approach that, if we saw in that middle definition there, it says the part of the mind that mediates between the conscious and the unconscious, responsible for reality testing, and this next piece right there, a sense of personal identity. As we have taken birth, anyone here was born? Anybody? Okay, so then you're the people I'm talking to. Anybody here will lay your body down at some point, then you're definitely the ones. While we're here, we have the appearance of a separate identity, of a distinct personal identity. And we can't be wrong for doing so. This is the nature of incarnation, that we have entered into a human reality where I am Michael, I'm not Bruce. And we need the ego to make that distinction. So I'm going to go back for this next bit of the message and talk about more of the psychological understanding of how we can have not no ego, but a healthy one. That's what we're really talking about. There's a woman named Suzanne Cook Greuters, and she is really brilliant. Cindy Wigglesworth has done a lot of her work and has gotten the certification in her training. She has developed something called the stages of ego development theory or ego development psychology. For those of you who are nerds like me and have studied spiral dynamics describes the levels of consciousness in human terms of both individuals and groups. And there are distinct levels that can be measured and talked about. And this, someone had described it, that spiral dynamics describes the ladder of human consciousness evolving. And what Suzanne's work does is it describes the climber of the ladder, the individual interior experience as we move through evolution, and that sense of the separate identity, the unique identity as the ego. It's very dense, so I'm not going to go into the work, but I just want to point out this little curve there you see on that model. The evolution of the ego goes from the left to the right, and the center point right there, that is, she describes that as a place kind of midway on the spiral of the highest ego identification. It's a place where the ego is strong, but it is the sole identity of the individual. What happens in the higher stages, the ego remains strong and healthy, but it's less and less identified with the individual. That's where we want to go, where we have a healthy ego. I know where my boundaries are. I know where I end and you begin, but I'm not my ego. My identity rests in the spiritual truth of the nature of the reality of which I am a part and created, not that egoic structure. She also describes the ego as the metabolizer of experience. I love that. Evidently, I'm the only one. I don't hear much response out there. But it's that part of us as we navigate this world from birth through all the changes of our lives unto death, we have an experience along the way, and we incorporate that experience into our reality and our identity. And the ego is what helps us do that. As we develop, have you ever noticed that children are very egocentric? Has anyone ever noticed this? If you've raised them, you know this. It's true. I had the honor and privilege of taking my little 5-year-old daughter of my heart. She's my, I guess, probably goddaughter, you would think of it, but I'm daddy to her. I'm the only dad in her life. And we took her to Disney World back in February. And let me tell you, it's all about her. And when it didn't go as she wanted it to go, have you ever seen an amusement park meltdown of a 5-year-old? You ever experienced that? That is the ego. As it's growing, that individualized experience, it's all about me and what I want. Have you ever seen adults have that kind of experience? We're not going to point out politicians of either party. We're not doing that. But have you seen what an immature ego looks like in the world? There's actually a psychological disorder called narcissistic personality disorder. And that's what a narcissist does. It's all about them all the time. One of the hallmarks of that narcissistic personality disorder is that they're unable to have empathy and compassion. They can see somebody hurt and wounded, and it doesn't move them. Because why? It's all about me. And it's an illness. That's not the way we're designed to be. And the challenge that I have seen in unity is that we give this message of you are a firework. Make them go, oh, oh, oh. And that is the spiritual truth of who we are. And sometimes the ego gets a hold of it and just says, yeah, oh, oh. That we can begin to conflate our spiritual identity and our separate identity with that message. And Ken Wilber talks about this in his work on the three faces of God. And if you'll remember, I've talked about that before. I don't want to go into too deeply, but there is the I, the I am a place where God shows up. There is the it, that everything is God. And then there is that thou relationship where I worship, I praise, I commune with God. And what Wilber says is without that piece of it, if there's not a transcendent reality in which that you're in relationship with, when you go from small mind to big mind, you go from small ego to big ego. And so there is a little bit of a danger in our teaching. We've got to find some way to find our humility, or else it's not going to be good. So what we need are some tools to develop a healthy ego. These are practices and actions that we take. And I was thinking about, there are many, I'm sure, but I was kind of scanning about my life and my experience and my spiritual walk. What are those things that have really helped me grow? I found that if you drink a lot of vodka every day until you become addicted, and then you can't not have it, and then you go to some rooms where they have bad coffee and usually some stale cigarette smoke, that's one way. But there's an easier path. That was just my way of learning some humility. That was my tool. I don't recommend it. You guys remember this book? Yes. The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. I was thinking this is the kind of things this is what I'm talking about. Let's review for a moment what the four agreements in this book are. The first agreement, let's read it together. Can you see it? Be impeccable with your word. And the second, don't take anything personally. And 3, don't make assumptions. 4, always do your best. I think that the first and the fourth are really about the way we go, how do I say this? The way we express. They're about what we're going to do into the world. And 2 and 3 are more about perception, the way we perceive the world. And that's what I want to focus on just real quickly about using the second and the third agreement of this work, the four agreements, as tools to grow our ego into a healthy state, is to not take things personally and to not make assumptions. When we don't take anything personally, we have to realize that nothing that others do is because of you. This was earth-shattering revelation to me. When I had my sponsor in Al-Anon, she said, honey, they're not doing it to you. They're just doing it. I was like, are you sure? It sure feels like they're doing it to me. But this is what we do. Don't take it personally. Even when they use your name and they're pointing at you. It's about them. It's about them and not about you. What others say and do is a projection of their own reality, and as Don Miguel would say, their own dream. And when we are immune to the opinions and actions of others, we will no longer be the victim of needless suffering. Have you all ever experienced that moment where you don't take it personally, and the freedom and the spaciousness in that, and then contrast it to the moment that you do take it personally? It hurts. Our feelings get hurt. It's not happening to you. It's just happening. And then the third, about not making assumptions, because you know what happens when you assume. Yes, okay. You find the courage to ask questions and express what you really want. Well, that's a novel concept. Instead of assuming that your husband is mad at you and that's why he didn't do the thing you asked him to do, maybe you could ask, what happened? You know, that was important to me. I really wanted you to help me out with that. Express what you really want. Ask questions and listen. Yeah, sometimes I'm good at asking questions and not listening to the response. But ask questions and listen. And then communicate with others as clearly as you can to avoid misunderstandings, sadness, and drama. I think we need a 12-step drama group. I mean, for recovery from drama addicts, you know. You know who you are. Things are a little too smooth and placid. I need to stir something up. I need some drama up in this house. All right. I love that Miguel Ruiz says this: with just this one agreement, you can completely transform your life. So those are a couple tools. I invite you to dust off your copy of the 4 agreements. We have it in our bookstore. Simple applications of spiritual principle that will begin to free you from that hostage situation with the ego. Don't take anything personally. So going back to that spiritual definition, and this is where I want to kind of begin to wind it down this evening. If the spiritual definition of the ego is the separate self, what is the opposite of that? The whole self, the connected self, the unified self. How do we live in that? How do we ignore the messages of the hostage-taking egoic mind and live in that space of wholeness and unity and connection? This is from Proverbs 21:2. A person may think their own ways are right, but the Lord weighs the heart. I think there's a clue here. The egoic mind will convince you that they're out to get you. But the heart knows love. The heart knows connection. And the Lord weighs the heart. There is and I think sometimes we use the heart in the ancient text as a way of describing intuitive knowing too, that wisdom of the heart. We know that there's more going on than we can see, but our mind feels like we sometimes have to make up stories about it. Don't always believe your own bad press, okay? Philippians 2:5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. The mind, when it's aligned with our spiritual truth, when we're walking with God, when we're in that space of the Christ mind, is what we talk about in unity a lot, that connected mind, then we live in that space of love and pure expression of God's own nature. This next verse is actually one of my favorites. It's from the book of the prophet of Micah 6:8. He has shown thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with thy God. The code here is this: treat people fairly. We need to live in a just society. If justice is important to you, I really do encourage you to take part in our Healing the Heart of America series, this dialogue on race. There are many, many places in our society that are not just yet. And this is our calling, is to live justly, fairly, to love mercy. Mercy is a beautiful old word, but I think today we'd probably be more comfortable in unity with the word compassionate. To be compassionate, to see that others are in suffering and in struggling, and instead of judging, but to be merciful and to walk humbly with thy God. And this is it. To walk humbly. Many people grew up with this idea that to walk humbly with God meant to be the lowly worm. You know, it's like in some of the old teachings in traditional Christianity, we're just dust and worms. That's what we are. Dust, earth, was it dust to dust? Earth to earth. And that to be humble does not mean to be humiliated. To be humble does not mean to be less than. The ego is always comparing and will always make someone better or worse. If we are walking humbly with God, that disappears. There is no competition. There is no comparison. When we walk humbly with God, we allow others the experience of being who they are and where they are. We don't need them to be different. If you're waiting for someone else to be different for you to be okay, that's the ego. That's not walking humbly with God. What this invites us to do is to trust. As I said last week, Alexis was teaching us this idea of we're afraid of God's will because we're not going to get what we want. What my experience is in my life, that is often true. I have not gotten what I wanted, and I got what was the will of God instead, which was way better than what I wanted. Way better. There is an infinite intelligence which created you and gifted you, and don't you think it might know a little bit better than your egoic separate mind of what's good for you? And we can trust it. We can trust life to move us into places where we will be able to reveal it. There was a line in the second verse of that song with a closed door. You remember that lyric, Siobhan? What is it? There's a door, and you have to open it so that... Maybe the reason that all the doors are closed because you can open the one that will lead you to the perfect road. Yeah. I thought I would have won many Tony Awards and been on Broadway, many in Up, or else it'd be like the next Elton John, all these things that my ego told me I wanted. There was I told you my big break story. Have you heard it? Well, Mindy said I might want to have a story. I'm going to tell it briefly because we're almost done here. I started singing when I was 23 professionally, and for my 20s, which was the the lost decade of alcoholism and deep depression and struggling to make a living as an artist, I just thought if I could get a big break, it would turn it all around. Somebody's going to walk into this dive piano bar where I'm working, and they're going to go, "We need him!" And it's going to change everything. And I would be plucked out of my miserable little life, and they would finally see who I was. That's what I thought was going to happen. And I was not particularly spiritual in those days, but I did have this sort of, not psychic awareness, but an intuitive, just a thing that landed in my head that said, you'll get your big break when you're 35. I don't know. I never told anybody about it. I just had the thought. So the big break never came in those 20s, and I was invited into those rooms with the bad coffee when I to begin my work in recovery. But when I was 27, I got to sing. I was the first time in a New Thought church. So 28 began recovery and began to live life by spiritual principles. And so by the time I was 35, I'd achieved some lasting sobriety. I had found my kind of place in the spiritual world. I was singing, writing spiritual songs. I was doing well. And the thought of a big break I didn't need anyone to fix me and change me so I could have a good life. I had done the work with Spirit. Spirit had done the work through me. I was healed. My life was whole. I didn't need a big break to be okay. I had this experience of getting booked at the Tremont Retirement Center in Dallas, Texas, right after my birthday, on my 35th birthday, and I was playing the senior prom, and they had made a mistake in the booking. They had booked me from 6 to 7, and the accordion band was going to be playing for I was the warm-up act for the accordion band. So I don't need a big break. I've hit the big time. They made a mistake in the booking because everybody was getting ready for the dance, and there was nobody there for me. I was singing to an empty room except for one person, Dottie. I used to sing there a lot, and I loved Dottie. She loved me. If any of the other ladies would try and come up and hug me, she'd get her walker between them and go, "Back off, he's mine." I mean, she was a character. It's just me and Dottie, and I thought, well, they're paying me. I'm going to sit here, and I'm going to give a concert for Dottie for an hour. And I did. I sang all of her favorite songs, and her favorite was Stardust by Hoagy Carmichael. Beautiful old song. She had met Hoagy Carmichael at a party in the 1950s. She said, "Ugly man, ugly man." She's a pistol. And as I'm singing that song, there was this sweet, sweet moment. And it felt to me like there was this sort of golden bubble around us where I was singing this song that she loved, and I loved the song too, and she was kind of humming along with me, and there was so much love and joy and fondness in that little bubble in that song. It was perfect. It was one of those perfect moments in life. There's nothing that could have improved it. perfect connection. The ego had nothing to do with it. Just love and music. And so at the end of my hour, I kissed her on the head, I got in my car, and I drove home. And then I thought, I thought I was going to have a big break by the time I was 35. And the next thing that happened, I had what I can only describe as this wash of awareness. It was like just this deluge just came over me, and I knew several things at the same time. I knew what my purpose was. My purpose is to sing and to speak from a place of such connection in my heart that other people are able to experience their own heart. And you don't feel what I feel when I sing, and you don't feel what Siobhan feels when she sings, but there's something in your gift that is similar. It opens people to experience. The second, as I realized that if I give my gift purely, then it feels exactly the same if I'm giving it to one person or 10,000. Again, the ego always wants to count and compare. It has nothing to do with your spiritual gift. And the third, I knew that was my big break, was to know that and know who I am. Yeah. So you are here to give your gift. The ego will keep you from expressing and experiencing life as it's meant to be for you. We have to make room for God. We have to open ourselves, make space for God to use us just where we are, as we are. Siobhan, will you come help me? Let's prepare for our meditation. Close your eyes and open your heart. And let us make room for God. Let us clear out the space of our comparing. Let us clear out the space in our minds and hearts where we are holding unforgiveness of another, where we are standing in judgment of something in the world. Let us let it go. Let us make room for Spirit to reveal love and peace and freedom. It is the ego that would keep us separate. It is the ego that would compare. It is the true nature of our being to love and accept, to express and experience the joy of life. This is who we are. This is what we've come here for. Let us make room.
I make room for God. 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 I make room for God.
So in this moment, Let us commit our hearts and intend with our mind, the mind that was in Christ Jesus, to be a space of allowing, a space of welcoming, a space of letting God move through our lives. In the place where we don't know what to do, at least we say, God, show me. When we're trying to figure it out, let's say, what wants to be revealed here? Show me. We make space in our hearts, in our minds, in our lives, in our families for God to show up.
I'm clearing out a space so God can move through me. I'm clearing out a space so God can speak through me. I am clearing out a space so God can love through me. I make room. I make room for God.
And so it is. Amen.